and welcome to this session of Fall 2021 Colloquium on Sense. I have the pleasure of introducing our presenter today, Dr. Amrhein, who will be presenting reconstructing the experience of the divine in ancient Mesopotamia, an argument for direct perception, decentralized cognition, and sensorial plasticity. Professor Amrhein is an art historian and curator who works with the archaeological record to interrogate the materiality of the divine in the ancient Middle East during the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires. Her work examines the metaphysical meaning of materials in various social contexts and their role in presencing the divine through intersections with visual iconography. In this work, she considers how human collaboration with the agency of materials and the engagement with technologies function as practices that perform identity. Her recent work also demonstrates how attention to materiality and the material record can enrich understandings of processes of social stratification and tension, including those involving imperial domination and gender exclusions, denaturalizing some of the silences produced by approaches to historical knowledge production that primarily privilege textual archives. Professor Amrhein is currently a visiting professor of classical and Near Eastern archaeology at Bryn College and completed her PhD in ancient Near Eastern art here at Penn. In addition, she has cultivated a practice of public scholarship through her work as a museum curator. She has worked on curatorial projects at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Penn Museum, and most recently served as a guest curator at NYU's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, where she co-curated the exhibition, A Wonder to Behold, Craftsmanship and Creation of Babylon's Historiography. So without further ado, Dr. Amrhein.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I would first of all like to extend my gratitude to Lauren and Andrew for inviting me to speak today and to be part of the Anthropology Colloquium series. It's an honor to be here, and an enormous thanks to all of you in the audience for being here with me in person. Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Anastasia, I think you could take off your mask. Yeah, I mean, can't she?
Can I use the microphone?
Isn't that practice?
No.
Yeah. It'll just be easier for everybody.
Is the microphone on?
She may not want to.
Yeah, if you don't want to, that's fine.
Hello, everyone. Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Great. Okay. So what I will present today are some of the theoretical and methodological issues that I have grappled with in my dissertation, which I completed here at Penn in the history of art this past August. My thesis investigated the ancient Mesopotamian sense of the divine, both in terms of theological conception as well as in terms of multisensory bodily experience, focusing on the first half of the first millennium BCE. The notion that, quote, sensation is a process that is both biological and cultural, end quote, as stated in the Colloquium abstract, has also been a central question for me, both from an edict and emic perspective. I argue that Cartesian dualisms such as mind-body, culture-nature, thinking-doing, seeing-touching, ideas, matter, and form-medium, where the first half of each pair is privileged, are anachronistic for understanding pre-modern and non-Western ontologies, and have severely hampered scholarship across the humanities. I have found new materialism to be a particularly useful lens for trying to move past the Enlightenment era ideals that are so deep-seated in our culture today. Ultimately, I take a monistic materialist position, which I believe approximates the ancient Mesopotamian worldview, and which is actually also the direction that mid-20th century scholars of ancient Western Asia such as Thorkild Jakobsen and Edith Parada, were headed in. The Assyrians and Babylonians did not actively distinguish between material and so-called immaterial phenomena, nor between first-hand and second-hand experience and perception. Moreover, divine and human beings were partible, composed of multiple material components, suggesting that the sensation and perception of these beings, as well as their agency, was also decentralized and plastic. The field of art history and the space of the museum have historically privileged and institutionalized sight as a rarefied sense. Such separation of an object from the lived world creates so-called critical distance and subject-object distinction, ensuring that viewers do not over-identify with the object. The material, tangible aspects of objects have also traditionally been considered secondary to their capacity to signify, symbolize, and represent something immaterial and external to themselves. In ancient Mesopotamia, however, objects were not simply points of visual admiration or disinterested contemplation confined to an institutional art context. They were intended to engage with both seen and unseen aspects of the broader material world, and as such were manipulated and experienced haptically. Objects could be effective on a visceral level, striking fear and awe in the viewer, as well as performative, agentive subjects in their own right, capable of eliciting change in the lived world by manipulating the actions of humans, deities, and demons as objects of their action. And here I am referring to the use of statues and figurines for apotropaic purposes, the use of figurines in various magical and medical rituals, witchcraft and anti-witchcraft, as well as the ritual killing of statues and reliefs understood to be tangible components of human and divine bodies. These points have been discussed by several scholars, most notably the art historian Zainab Bahrani, although her emphasis has been specifically on images. I would like to suggest that it is the materiality of objects that was essentially vital. That is, images were not free-floating specters, but were fundamentally bound up with and owed their existence to their material supports. When I say materiality, I'm referring to the embodied, culturally specific experiences and meanings of both unworked materials, as well as the iconic and aniconic objects created with those materials. In art history, materiality is too often limited to the illusionistic representation of objects in paintings. Most existing scholarship on ancient Western Asia, regardless of discipline, uses the term materiality to refer to objects as the physical materialization of various abstract concepts, creating a problematic duality, if not privileging the so-called immaterial. This is also the case in a lot of anthropological literature, such as the work of Elizabeth Desmarais, Chris Austin, and Colin Renfrew. Within anthropology, although scholars have focused on the circulation of objects in the lived world, unlike in art history, it is ultimately the social life of objects that is usually emphasized. For example, Arjuna Padurai, among others, has been concerned with objects only to the extent that they are the externalizations of humans and reflect human concerns. According to Padurai, quote, "Things have no meaning apart from human transactions," end quote. Others, such as Lynn Maskell, Daniel Miller, and Colin Renfrew, have since recognized the role of objects in constituting human identities and relationships, demonstrating that objects create people as much as people create objects. These ideas go back to the suggestion of sociologist Marcel Mauss that artifacts are both expressive and capable of engendering social effects. Such theory remains problematic, however, in its maintenance of a dichotomy between the material material, and the mental, the social, or the symbolic, which cannot be assumed to be universal, as pointed out by Manuel Arroyo Kalin and Tim Ingold. And this is essential to realize if we are to attempt an emic understanding of the cultures that we are studying. Moreover, as pointed out by anthropologist and art historian Christopher Pinney, objects may carry their own histories and desires, independent of their interaction with humans. Such views have received criticism from Mescal and Miller, among others, because they risk understating the role of human agents and presenting history as simply a flow of, quote, unmotivated, end quote, events taking place outside of human control. The latter, highly anthropocentric accounts, however, cannot accommodate the views of many non-Western and pre-modern cultures, which do in fact see the object, whether iconic or not, as ontologically equivalent with the subject being represented, and expect viewers to over-identify with what they see in a bodily, multisensorial fashion. Another issue in the study of ancient Western Asian material culture is that scholars tend to consider only completed objects in their sensory experience, while the processes of creation are rarely discussed. Materials themselves are usually considered in terms of rarity and economic value, or in terms of their magical and medical uses, studied exclusively and abstractly through texts. Art historians such as Eileen Winter, however, have highlighted how aesthetic, economic, and magical values were bound up with the physical properties of materials. Although Winter has argued that materials such as gold and lapis lazuli reflect divinity. Kim Benzel's study of the jewelry from the Royal Cemetery at Ur, which builds upon Winter's work, is informed by her training as a jeweler and does in fact engage closely with materials and technologies. She concludes, however, that the physical properties of materials activate cultural conceptions and produce or reproduce the divine. Despite the significance of their contributions, both Benzel and Winter thus ultimately maintain the dualism of the material and the symbolic. In terms of agency, it is again finished objects that are typically considered, and agency is understood in purely social terms. Following the work of anthropologist Alfred Gell, that agency as well as meaning are attributed or ascribed by humans to materials and objects. As Gell states, these entities are to be, quote, treated as person-like, as sources of and targets for social agency, end quote. So what is missing in existing scholarship on ancient Western Asia is an acknowledgement and an investigation of the physical agency of materials and the decentering of human agency. The material and the symbolic or social were not differentiated in ancient Mesopotamia, nor were primary and secondary perception. Maintaining a distinction between humans and non-humans, thoughts and actions, symbols, concepts, and objects, materials, which has been the norm in the existing Edic approaches, has artificially distanced us as scholars from the people we are studying, unnecessarily othering them. We are, however, at a moment in time when scholars are recognizing the existence of multiple ontologies across time and space, and our own ontology, at least as presented by the new materialists, is starting to find some overlap with that of ancient Mesopotamia. Material and sociocultural phenomena are not two essentially distinct realms, existing respectively outside our bodies and inside our minds. The philosophical rupture between the so-called mental and the material, visual image and material support, as well as an emphasis on visuality at the expense of materiality, can be located historically within the Renaissance in 16th century Europe, when ideas and two-dimensional images became privileged over materials and three-dimensional objects, and were seen to originate in the minds of artists, who thus transformed inert materials into inert, fundamentally meaningless materials into art. Although it is an oversimplification to say that the last 500 years or so have been defined by Cartesian philosophy, given that some Enlightenment thinkers, such as David Hume, held far less dualistic views, dualism has nonetheless left an indelible mark on both Western scholarship and colloquial ways of understanding the world, to the extent that it is exceedingly difficult for us to think in monistic, materialist terms. As art historian Caroline Walker-Bynum has emphasized for the medieval Christian context, however, objects, quote, should be understood as the immediate presence of the holy, more than indexes, icons, or symbols pointing to something else, end quote. That is, as vibrantly active stuff that was quite literally a locus of divine agency, according to Bynum. And this was true for ancient Mesopotamia as well. I argue that particularly in the first half of the first millennium BCE, the Assyro-Babylonian divine was conceived of as a fundamentally formless matter energy, to use Jane Bennett's term, that existed since primordial times and served as the creative substance that gave rise to all other forms, forces, and beings of the universe. According to the Enuma Elish, at the beginning of time, the primeval waters of Apsu, or sweet water, and male matter energy, and Tiamat, or salt water, and female matter energy intermixed, causing silt, Lachmu and Lahamu, to rise to the surface, from which subsequent deities, as well as humans and animals, were formed. The generative nature of this intermixing speaks to a Mesopotamian belief in the fundamental agency of materials and substances, akin to new materialist views. Matter was creative and meaningful to the Mesopotamians simply by virtue of its existence and interactivity with other matter. Upon Marduk or Ashur's defeat of Tiamat, the massacred body of this primordial divinity is stretched out as the heavens, her tail forming the Milky Way. Clouds are shaped from her foam. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are let flow from her eyes. Her spittle becomes winds and rainstorms. Her breasts serve as the foundations for spring-bearing mountains. In turn, various monsters were born of such innately divine landscape features, suggesting that they too, as a result, carried a germ of primordial divinity within their beings. In the ancient Mesopotamian cultural context, the agency of non-human forces was thus explicitly recognized. Atmospheric and natural phenomena, as well as the physicality of materials, all conceptualized as divine, lay largely outside of human control, although attempts were made to influence or redirect the divine material forces. The Mesopotamians also recognized that while matter can shape-shift, it cannot dematerialize. The divine media of creation constituted their very bodies and environment and were continuously recycled. In making magical figurines or medical ointments, humans were interacting with the very same minerals that existed at the beginning of time, the clay of creation and the water of the Apsu. Following the original creation, humans themselves were formed out of the clay contained in the uterus, and upon death they returned to the earth, being already made of clay. Indeed, as various new materialism theorists have observed, quote, we swim in an ocean of materials, end quote, and are ourselves, quote, walking, talking minerals, end quote. We are made of the very same stuff as various non-human entities, including components of the environment and the cosmos, and this totality cannot functionally be pulled apart. To this end, Jane Bennett has also pointed out that although humans are, quote, particularly rich and complex collections of materials, end quote, we do not hold a privileged position in the universe, nor are we removed from the systemic processes of matter that make up both us and the universe. Although some scholars present the Mesopotamian universe as a dichotomy of human and divine realms, respectively material and immaterial, there is in fact substantial evidence for the increasingly intimate connection between humanity and the divine in the late 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, as well as the tangibility and interpenetration of the cosmic realms. Various texts, including epics, demonstrate that the heavens were accessible by a road, gate, or staircase, while mountains, deserts, steppes, and bodies of water, including the water table, led to the netherworld and other divine realms. The heavens were made in part of gemstones, and the netherworld largely of dust, and both featured architecture similar to that of the human world. The human and divine worlds were thus fundamentally material, composed of the very same matter energy, which allowed real, continued interactions that were the norm rather than the exception to take place. There was no immaterial, shadowy realm of deities and demons severed from the lived human experience. This is evocatively captured by a description of Jaundice the demon, breaking through the ground like a plant coming out from the netherworld. Although often invisible, the Mesopotamian divine was always material and experienced haptically. For example, both demons and gods could be encountered as illnesses that seize or strike and then release a person. The demon Pazuzu could be experienced as the wind. Although as scholars we tend to privilege the anthropomorphic form of deities, divine beings are regularly and often simultaneously described in non-anthropomorphic terms as well. Jacobson has pointed out that divine names demonstrate that a divinity was understood to be, for example, both, quote, the visible sun as well as the invisible power in it, the sun god, end quote. A simpler and more literal, monistic, materialist interpretation would be that Shamash is the sun, the celestial body visible in the sky, and the physically felt heat that brings warmth and causes plants to grow, yet can also cause bodily harm such as sunburns and sunstroke, and exacerbate droughts. Some scholars have stressed that Mesopotamian descriptions of divine natural phenomena must be understood as metaphoric, emphasizing that, like us, they were capable of abstract, rational thought. However, the Western ontological tradition is not more highly evolved or objectively more correct. It represents just one way of viewing the world. In addition to the sun god's rays, the light of other celestial bodies could also have a healing power, and individuals were often exposed to the irradiation of specific stars or constellations of the night sky. As Assyriologist Erica Reiner has observed, the stars could exert a direct influence on humanity. More specifically, I suggest that it is the rays of light as material extensions of the celestial bodies that were ways for the divine to come directly and physically in touch with humans. Mesopotamians of all social spheres also regularly interfaced with the divine to the extent that it permeated the Mesopotamian universe in the form of atmospheric phenomena and natural elements, including raw minerals, which could be worked into objects, as well as various social and physical ills and blessings identified with demons and personal gods. According to the new materialists, everything is material, including thought and so-called symbolic or cultural phenomena. In earlier scholarship, anthropologist Dan Sperber had meditated on the so-called mind-body problem stating that materialism is unproblematic, quote, as long as you do not begin to reflect on the existence of sociocultural phenomena, end quote. In other words, as scholars, we seem to be okay with monistic materialism as an abstraction within philosophy, but it becomes more difficult for us to accept it in art history, anthropology, and related fields. Nonetheless, despite the counterintuitiveness of this philosophical position to the modern Western mind, Sperber goes on to explain cognition as a material process, looking to neuroscience and using the function of computers as a model. More recently, the development of smart textiles, which are able to sense, think, and respond, has further pushed scholars to reconsider the previously entrenched distinctions between mind and matter, human and non-human, and thus to better understand cultures such as ancient Mesopotamia, where such dichotomies did not exist in the first place. Ultimately, what is perceived by humans to be immaterial phenomena, that is, the social, the cultural, and so-called mental images, as well as other sensations, are in fact neurological phenomena or physical brain states. Sperber thus makes a distinction between public and private rather than material and mental images, and references epidemiology to model the relationship between these representations. Likewise, relying on neuroscience, the art historian Barbara Maria Stafford has similarly discussed the repeated unconscious material interactions between brain and world, through which internal or mental images self-generate based on previously encountered and stored external images. Thus, internal imagery cannot be generated out of thin air, nor is it simply a copy of something existing in the outside world. Both perception and creation of images are complex back and forth processes involving the interaction, including alteration and modification, of images that have different material supports but are not ontologically distinct. The notion of the brain as a material support for imagery has been discussed especially by Hans Belting in his Anthropology of Images, as well as by media theorist W.J.T. Mitchell, whose scholarship suggests that ultimately no image can be truly immaterial, because it is always perceived and interpreted with the human body in a multimodal manner, simultaneously involving both haptic experience and cognitive engagement, both being physical processes. Mitchell, following Wittgenstein, has also noted that the distinction of mental and physical images is a fallacy, because neither is, quote, stable, static, or permanent, end quote. The perception of both is highly variable, dependent on the viewer's past experiences and physiology. And finally, neither material or mental images are exclusively visual. Notably, the Sumerologist Thorkel Jakobsen has also discussed the materiality of Mesopotamian images, albeit implicitly. His suggestion that we understand images in this cultural context not in terms of real or unreal, but in terms of degrees of staying power, is particularly compelling. In other words, dreams and visions, for example, were just as material as images rendered in stone or pigment, only less permanent. The phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty has made a similar argument in his discussion of perception and dreams in The Visible and the Invisible, as in fact being ontologically indistinct, owing to the fact that we experience both. The ontological equivalence of so-called mental and material images in ancient Mesopotamia is also suggested by the materiality of dreams and visions, which were direct haptic encounters with the divine and could not be held back, as suggested by texts such as Lugobanda in the Mountain Cave. So I'll read this excerpt. Sleep is a raging flood which sweeps over the body as a wall washed away by water. Its hand is overpowering, its foot carries away everything. Dream, a door cannot hold it back, nor can the doorpost. It is the closed archive basket of the gods. Anzakar, god of dreams, roared in person to Ugobanda as a bull. Ugobanda woke up. This was a dream. He shivered. It was sleep. He rubbed his eyes. It was terror. Dreams are also described as burdens, or arnu, reporting the dream to another individual being the only way to relieve this physical oppression. Dreams, however, could also be physically comforting. One Neo-Assyrian letter records a dream experience where the god Bel placed his hand upon my hand, saying, "My hand is upon your hand." In another dream, a goddess relieves the king Ashurbanipal's anxiety by swaddling him in her sweet-smelling baby sling, protecting his entire body. Dreams were also physically felt because they were instigated by material entities in the lived world. This is captured by a Neo-Babylonian amulet that depicts a person, presumably awakened from a nightmare, fearfully pointing to a snake dragon emerging from under their bed, while another figure attacks the monster. In the related Hulbazizi incantation identified by Assyriologist Franz Wigermann, this being is, quote, an unnamed evil that causes frightening dreams. He who has transgressed the privacy of my bed, end quote. Zainab Bahrani has also noted that dreams were messages from the gods regarding the dreamer's future. Akin to other types of more conventionally material omens, such as celestial phenomena discussed by Sumerologist Chris Woods, dreams were tangible fragments or traces of the future. They were harbingers of events that had already happened in the divine realm that visited the dreamer in a very direct and physical way. Bodies, both human and divine, were also understood to be composed of multiple additive components, including non-organic objects owned by the person, such as seals and elements of dress, as well as images, all of which could effectively presence the individual even after death. The physical human body could thus also be affected remotely, as in the case of magic and witchcraft, especially through the use of clay figurines, as well as through iconoclasm. Such multifaceted personhood has also been discussed in depth in the context of Melanesia, and is in fact more common across cultures than the bounded mind-body duality of the modern Western world. In the case of the divine, various aspects of the material world, including rivers, mountains, winds, celestial bodies, and raw materials, such as stones, metals, and trees, appear in Mesopotamian texts with the Dingir determinative, which also precedes god names, suggesting that all of these entities held equal divine status and agency, even though some scholars assume a hierarchy of holiness. In fact, many of the above entities, as well as cultic appurtenances such as chariots, crowns, beds, weapons, and musical instruments, appear in god lists and received regular offerings and prayers alongside anthropomorphic cult images, which suggests that they were divine in their own right, not through association with anthropomorphic gods. Ultimately, although anthropomorphic cult statues were official divine presences, serving particularly the needs of the palace and temple, this was not the only way of interacting with the divine, especially because no single visual form, material, or phenomena could fully capture or presence the greater, unbounded divine, but only localize, fix, concentrate, or direct portions of it. The so-called God description texts further demonstrate that the universe was made up of interchangeable material divine elements, and that the greater divine could shapeshift and take multiple forms simultaneously. In these texts, the anthropomorphic body parts of a deity are equated with various animals, celestial phenomena, minerals, and manufactured objects, as seen here. Such texts convey the vastness and omnipresence of the greater divine matter energy that was equivalent to the entirety of the universe. As such, it could not be perceived by humans all at once, but only in fragments. These texts also capture the vitality of the universe as a great composite living material body. To sum up my discussion thus far, in Mesopotamia, representations, whether sculptures or reliefs, were real presences. They were, quote, active, powerful beings, end quote, as opposed to inanimate objects, which has been demonstrated particularly by Edith Parada and Zeynep Bahrani. I have suggested that dreams, visions, and mental images were also fundamentally material and affective presences. The multisensory experience of all of these representations, despite their varying material supports and fragmented nature, were understood to be actual, direct encounters with the divine. Recent scholarship in neuroscience and cognition has also demonstrated that both first-hand and second-hand perceptive encounters are processed by the brain in the same way. Studies conducted with macaque monkeys, for example, have shown that whether an individual is performing a given action themselves or watching another individual carry out the task, the brain responds in the same way. The same brain cells, called mirror neurons, are activated. These findings have been utilized by Barbara Maria Stafford to demonstrate the capacity of artworks as second-hand and presumably indirect encounters to affect viewers in very tangible ways. Ultimately, perception is a physical process that always involves the collaboration of the brain, the nervous system, and all of the body's sensory organs. To this end, cognitive scientist Andy Clark has characterized the brain as leaky, meaning that cognition extends even beyond the body to include the external world. An organism, thus, cannot be understood outside of its context. This is most evident in the case of Alzheimer's patients who rely on triggers in the external world to be able to carry out their daily activities. And another frequently cited example of dispersed, distributed, or decentralized cognition is the spider and its web, which is technically external to the spider's body, yet is a crucial component of the spider's sensory apparatus. Moreover, experimental technologies such as TVSS, or tactile visual sensory substitution for blind people, have debunked the traditional understanding of the senses as discrete, revealing their plasticity. The human perceptual system is not statically wired to process tactile, visual, and other stimuli through specific set channels. Rather, the senses can merge, overlap, and take over one another's functions. For example, a blind person can interpret tactile sensations as images with the help of TVSS technology that converts photos into vibrations. Thus, quote, not just seeing with touch, but seeing as touch, end quote. In this context, I'd like to briefly touch upon the material features of various media and their categorization schemes in ancient Mesopotamia. It is first of all important to recognize that the material properties that we choose to identify and scientifically measure, whether color, weight, porosity, degrees of hardness, electrical conductivity, etc., cannot be said to be inherent nor universally acknowledged. Moreover, all of these properties, not to mention those that we cannot perceive or measure, are interconnected. It is thus a fallacy to study these features separately, because in practice, they are always experienced together, synesthetically. In the newest Syrian text series, Abnu Shakinshu, usually translated as the stone whose appearance is, minerals are ordered and described in terms of what seems to be their visual appearance, that is, patterns and distribution of color, as well as luster or lack thereof. However, many stones are compared to various animals and natural phenomena, and many descriptors evoke haptic and textural qualities as well. For example, like the coat of a date palm, like the back of a frog, like the fur of a bear, like a mouse's ear, like an unripe grape, which may refer not simply to color, but also to synesthetic connections between color and taste, touch, or smell. Clay and related minerals are also cataloged in what may seem as an inconsistent fashion to us in terms of color, texture, weight, smell, and taste, as well as place of origin and composition. For example, some clay types include white, gold, red, black, hard, heavy, bitter, pounded, mixed, rubble originating from the sea, from the river, or from the mountains. Such catalogs of minerals also typically include unique magico-medical functions of each substance. To me, these descriptors also speak to how attuned the ancient Mesopotamians were to their surroundings and material agencies and affordances of materials. As raised earlier in this talk, most scholars, including anthropologists Christopher Tilley and Carl Nappet, maintain a distinction between the, quote, social lives, end quote, of materials or objects, that is, the extent to which they take part in the social world of humans and are endowed with meaning, and their fundamental existence as, quote, brute, end quote. Although Nappet, for example, has suggested that the concept of materiality mediates between the material and social realms, following Bruno Latour's notion that, quote, the two bring each other forth, end quote, he still privileges the social, stating that the properties of materials are, quote, secondary to the role of the artifact in social relations, end quote. To this end, Daniel Miller has stated that it is the social that is ultimately the concern of the anthropologist. However, we must allow for ontologies that perceive materials as asocial entities, that meaning and agency are not only something that can be ascribed by humans. Tim Ingold, among a handful of new materialist scholars, has specifically sought to re-emphasize the role of non-human material forces. According to these scholars, the agency of materials, objects, and other non-human entities stems from their very material composition and physical presence in the world, aspects which they share with humans. Thus, in contrast to Gell's view, agency is not necessarily social, nor does it encompass the explicit intention to act. Organic and inorganic matter has also been described by the new materialists as equally intelligent and self-organizing rather than chaotic. Complex forms and actions are constantly being carried out without the involvement of brains or mindful intention, as can be seen in weather systems in the lives of single-cell organisms. Materials and objects can thus be understood to be alive, not because they have been expressly animated by some invisible force, whether the divine or the human mind, but because they are part of the greater active life world. Such a view is more accommodating of non-Western and pre-modern worldviews, such as that of ancient Mesopotamia, where elements of nature, atmospheric phenomena, minerals and objects, as well as illnesses and concepts such as good or bad luck, were all understood to be vital and agentive. Ingold has characterized such an ontology as animistic as opposed to animist, referring to people's, quote, openness, heightened sensitivity and responsiveness, end quote, to their environment's vitality and fluidity. Tilley has likewise pointed out that such a, quote, concrete and sensuous rather than abstract, end quote, way of perceiving and thinking is in fact inherent to all peoples, although it is often intentionally denied and suppressed. So what I am ultimately interested in is centering materials as active collaborators in the production of Mesopotamian material culture and arguing against the notion of images as immaterial and free-floating. To this end, a compelling methodological approach that I have come across is that of art historian Anastasia Amrhein, who investigates the agency of paint in the Netherlandish context. She argues that because oil paint shared the physical properties of the actual objects and substances represented in this medium, it was integral in developing the idiosyncratic technique and naturalistic style of Netherlandish painting. For example, oil paints could be made semi-translucent, enabling the depiction of water, marble, smoke, sheer fabric, and human skin. Thus, materials are not neutral recipients of arbitrary meaning, as linguist Ferdinand de Saussure might argue. They are the asserters of meaning and structure what it is that we do with them. As argued by several anthropologists, as well as philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, signification is not the inscription and retrieval of meaning by human minds. Rather, it is how the world is, quote, brought forth, end quote. It is material causality. According to the anthropological concept of material affordances from psychology, human and non-human entities all afford certain actions to one another in the context of their interaction. For humans, this may include specific ways of handling, working, and even thinking about materials and objects. These actions are delimited by the interacting entities' specific materialities. According to psychologist James Gibson, perception and action are both situated and cannot be separated out into a sequence of discrete steps. Thus, quote, the potential of an object we're sitting on could be directly observed without first categorizing the object as a chair, end quote. Following Gibson, philosopher Jose Luis Bermudez has argued that cognition is the perception of multisensory sensations. That is, the affordances offered by one's environment and other entities that share their environment. Although human perception may be more complex, it is not fundamentally different from the proto-thoughts of single-cell organisms that likewise perceive and respond to the affordances around them. Am I out of time? Clay matter energy was perhaps the most ambiguous and multivalent aspect of the greater divine. This inherent malleability and essential amorphousness of clay allowed this medium to take on many visual forms, thereby channeling and directing or redirecting a wide array of beings and forces in magical or ritual contexts. As a primordial divine material that was also the physical makeup of humanity, clay minerals and their iterations, such as soil, dust, and potsherds, were regularly applied as compresses and even consumed in order to physically patch up ailing human bodies. Owing to the role of clay or soil in the original creation and subsequent procreation, as well as agricultural fertility, this divine matter energy was culturally gendered female in Mesopotamia. In my dissertation, I suggest that engagement with clay, particularly by women to make figurines, was instrumental in the formation and expression of individual and group identity, as well as the continuation of human life, both in biological and social terms, and the alleviation of its numerous inherent problems. We know from texts that figurines were used for protection and aided communication with the greater divine. Other figurines absorbed or redirected evil in healing and anti-witchcraft rituals, or affected individuals remotely in love spells. Conception, safe pregnancy and birth, as well as the subsequent health of the mother and child were also of particular concern. Specifically because figurines are made out of clay, I believe their iconographic ambiguity to be intentional. The female figurines, for example, have been interpreted as goddesses, although there is no strong support for this. They do not wear the typical horned headdress, nor do they have any attributes that might identify them. Of course, being made of clay, they can be understood as divine beings in a broad sense, even if they might represent mortal humans or unspecified and unnamed goddesses. Typically, figurines are cataloged in publications as male or female, but upon closer inspection, it's really difficult to put many of them in either category. There is sex and gender ambiguity, especially in the case of the vase-bearer figurines, some of whom have beards and breasts or lack any sex or gender markers. Such figurines may be intersex or non-binary gendered individuals, and it is also possible that figurine users projected various human and or divine identities onto these figurines, depending on the context. And there are also a number of kind of humanoid figurines that have animal and human features, or animals and human postures with human attributes. Akin to clay minerals, various stones also held specific magical and medical functions and could be placed on the body as well as ground up and consumed. The divinity and agency of these materials is indicated not only in the god lists discussed earlier, but in texts such as the Lugal A epic, which recounts the god Ninurta's subjugation of the Asaku demon in primordial times, and the god's subsequent blessing or cursing of 50 stones, the demon's offspring, depending on their role in the struggle. Seals carved of stone were worn on the body by humans and gods alike, and served emuletic as well as administrative functions. Scholarship on these objects, however, has focused almost exclusively on iconography, and publications have traditionally included only drawings of the images or photographs of modern impressions, until very recently with online publications. Such an approach and presentation disembodies images from their ground and does not consider seals as objects. In the early centuries of the first millennium BCE, Assyrian seals were hand-carved in soft, locally quarried light or dark stones and featured royal or elite iconography. By the late 8th and 7th centuries, however, both the media and imagery of seals changed drastically. Significantly harder stones, especially quartzes, necessitated the use of drills, cutting wheels, and files, and represented scenes focused predominantly around deities. Paying attention to such media shifts reveals significant changes in the implementation of power, political struggles and conflicts, trade routes, and most significantly for today's talk, the conception of divinity over the course of the Neo-Assyrian period. Quartz seals typically depict worshippers approaching anthropomorphic deities whose identities cannot be ascertained for the most part, as they are lacking consistent or unique attributes. Their salient feature is rather their awe-inspiring divine radiance, called the Malamu, which is for the first time represented graphically. The Malamu is rendered as a nimbus, or rays of stars that surround the deity, or it can be suggested by the presence of stars on the deity's throne or in other arrangements in the figure's vicinity. And in some cases, the stars are simplified and rendered as drill dots. The desirability of these hard stones and their appropriateness for representing the divine had to do in part with their distant origin at the edges of the human world, in mountainous zones where the sun god Shamash emerged from the netherworld every morning, and which were points of entry to divine realms inaccessible to humans. In addition to their durability and hardness, translucency, and potential for sheen and bright color, these are the features that made quartzes valuable. But notably, quartzes also possess several luminescent qualities, such as triboluminescence, which is the emission of a flash of variably colored light resulting from friction when a stone is broken, crushed, scratched, rubbed, or otherwise impacted, which you can see here. It's visible both in a lit environment as well as in the dark. Additionally, quartz exhibits thermoluminescence, or the emission of light as a result of heating, and phosphorescence, or a glow-in-the-dark effect, as seen here, following exposure to sunlight, which may be visible even in shaded areas. This is significant given the depiction of the Malamu on seals carved in these very same stones, as well as the increased characterization of the divine as bright, blinding, flashing light in texts of this period, often described as lightning, fire, or in fact gemstones. Moreover, in the Abnu Shakinshu series, which lists and describes the characteristics of various stones, brilliance and possibly luminescent phenomena are emphasized. For example, stones are described as like a sunset, like a rainbow, like gold, like a carp in a river, shining like a lump of salt, and others refer to iridescence of the plumage of birds and scales of fish. The luminescent qualities of quartzes must also be kept in mind given the difficulty of working these materials, that is, their resistance to being carved. The carving process would have certainly created enough heat and physical impact to manifest thermoluminescence and triboluminescence. And I'll also note that the color of most quartzes is enhanced, specifically through the application of heat. So as portable objects, seals were a primary locus for accessing and experiencing the divine outside of the formal settings of the temple, or processions when cult images might be glimpsed. Quartzes are already very mutable without taking into account their luminescent properties. They change color depending on the lighting conditions, and as one handles these seals, images of the divine appear and disappear with the light, in contrast to the consistent legibility of darker, softer stone seals. Light is reflected from the drill and cut marks, as well as the polished surface, and may also be refracted through the stone itself. As such, seals capture a small material fragment of the greater divine and make it accessible and manipulable. Although in handling a seal, the play of light affords momentary glimpses of the divine, it also emphasizes the ultimate unknowability of the greater divine. A good look is denied by virtue of the dazzling luminosity of the seal. So to conclude, I hope my talk has shown how new materialism can help us comprehend the innate divinity and agency of matter in Mesopotamia as independent of human ascription. I have argued that the entire Assyro-Babylonian universe was understood as divine matter energy, as ambiguous, mutable, partible material force that lacked innate or consistent visual form. Various minerals, such as clay and stone, were those tangible fragments of the greater divine that extended beyond the visible, lived human world. Specific human acts, however, including the articulation of iconic visual form, understood to be simultaneously technological and ritual, could fix, quicken, focus, or direct divine matter energy to specific ends beneficial to humanity. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for that talk, and we'll open up to y'all for questions.
Yes.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. One of the things that struck me is that a great deal of your discussion involves the discussion of certain textual traditions. And of course, speech itself, in every one of its forms, can only be encountered through the manipulation of matter.
Yes.
Whether in spoken acoustical form or in written inscriptional form. And that once this modality of the manipulation of matter is deployed, various common nouns like mind and matter can be defined as relatable to each other in one way or another. So there is the Cartesian tradition that formulates them as dichotomous. There is the Mesopotamian tradition that formulates them as monistic, in the sense in which you argue. All of that makes perfect sense to me, and it strikes me that, in a certain sense, in this notion of materiality that you're arguing for, the manipulation of matter that is so critical to all variants includes speech itself in its various modalities, right? Now, the other thing that struck me, and all of that I thought was wonderful, and I thought this way of formulating it allows us to see what the contrast is and how important it is. Because after all, we don't want to use Cartesian text to understand Mesopotamian material, of course, right? Okay. But the other thing that I want to ask you about was I was puzzled by what you spoke of when you spoke of clay matter agency. I was puzzled by it, not because I don't get the physical attributes of clay or how they're relevant, or even when you talk about the imagery of seals and the crystal, obviously the physical attributes are crucial. But what puzzled me about the phraseology of clay matter agency is what about the hands that are shaping the clay? What about the fact that the clay artifact, once shaped, is amenable to discursive construals, such as this one is divine, this one has a human identity, you see? So that it strikes me that in some ways, whereas the idea of materiality that you're talking about is an extremely interesting one, right? It needs to be articulated perhaps in such a way that these various partials of it can be made to work together rather than, because in a certain sense, the older European dichotomies, which you rightly reject, ought not, it seems to me, to force the terms of the debate so much. Just rejecting them outright is good, but then treating this material in a way. Anyway, so those are just my thoughts. I very much enjoyed it, but it struck me that there are ways of strengthening it without getting entangled in what are obviously absurd ideas from an earlier era of Europe. You know?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of scholars still rely on these ideas, perhaps inadvertently. So I'm just bringing attention to that. And your point about the agency of human hands with clay, I didn't talk about this, but in Mesopotamia, the use of the molds was very prevalent, even though there are, of course, handmade figurines and pottery is handmade. But there's this idea of images being given to humanity by the gods at the beginning of time, and then every time you make an image, you kind of have to adhere to this original authoritative prototype, and so molds are one way to do that. And arguably these prototypes can be in your mind as well, that you are repeating. Mesopotamia is always described as a very conservative culture, visually speaking. And so I think that really speaks to the kind of big use of the mind or the brain as a mold or a place where these authoritative images are stored and passed on. And the other point I wanted to emphasize is the ways in which clay is a matter energy comes from the creation epics, and the idea that clay is the first matter that kind of emerges out of the liquid components of the universe, and deities kind of self-form. There's no external force forming that clay. So I think that's really central, at least the Mesopotamian view of clay, even though it is so malleable and receptive to touch. I think that was maybe something that they were struggling with a bit, if that makes sense.
Right, that's a very interesting point, but once again, you see the people who are shaping the clay, whether through bare hands or through the intermediary of shaped molds, are also people who have read the sacred text, which contain, or are familiar with them in the sense that even if they haven't read them, the point is, the ideas of the divinity that they get cannot be segregated from the religious traditions to which they all belong, which would explain why they have such and such ideas, whereas the Europeans have some other ideas.
Yeah,
You know what I'm
I
saying?
agree.
So again, think of the brain as a passive mold doesn't strike me as helpful, simply because it can in fact be shaped through these traditions. So that in one place you have one set of ideas, in another place you have a different set of ideas.
True, yeah. Thank you.
Anyway, wonderful talk. I hope this is helpful in helping you take this in a way which I
Yes,
think very
very
should
much
go.
so.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Lauren?
So, I guess I had two questions. Most are coming off of Austin's question, and mine are a bit more into the material. I was interested in thinking about the ways that clay can be transformed through firing or sun-drying or not. And I was also thinking about that sort of the malleability, either the way that these processes, of course, fix it in a certain form, or don't, and sort of ways that maybe figurines are transformed and untransformed. I just was,
I didn't get a chance to kind of point out some of the differences between different types of figurines, but there are some that are specifically left unbaked, and those are the ones that go into the foundations of buildings, and that's clearly intentional because they kind of disintegrate and melt back into the ground. And then, the other types of figurines are baked, which, so far my interpretation of that is that they were intended to be used above ground for various ongoing rituals. But I think the potentiality of clay is something that can be both almost liquid and then, varying degrees of hardness, and then it can be baked and even, ground up into a powder. The terminology for all these materials, including dust, soil, they use the same word. So that's really interesting. That seems to be kind of an inherent part of what clay is that it can transform. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. No, I'm sorry, it was making me think of other things. And also, of course, like within this cultural milieu, that clay tends to be how people write, right?
Yeah.
And also you get that. So I was thinking also just the fact that you do get these, you do have the sense that the clay that you write on is recycled as well. I know I estimated a lot of tablet blocks, which I'll talk to you about, where like they clearly were taking school texts and wetting them and like reforming them for other things. So I guess I'm sort of interested then in thinking about how this might also play upon other ideas of writing, and also maybe Zainab Bakrani and Margaret Neuro and John Bushro's like notions of how kind of both text and icons can work for formational.
Yeah, I think definitely some of those ideas of Bed in Europe and Butterell and Bahrani, I think definitely come from the recognition that it's the same material being used. Holly?
Hi, thank you very much. If we turn to images instead of the material, and you have the position that images are also material. This idea that Mesopotamia is very conservative and limited culture in terms of images. In fact, in the Neo-Assyrian period especially, we see images just explode. And so whereas in the Neo-Babylonian culture, we really have very few images almost at the same time. So I'm just interested in understanding more clearly how this new generative production of images, telling all kinds of stories, fits within your ideas of the images being divine and being alive. Do they all have the same status, regardless of the mundane subject matter of them? They all have this divine agency. Is that where?
I think so. Yeah, I think they do. Because for many people, a seal or figurine would be the only way that they could, engage with the divine outside of, the weather. It's kind of the only way that they could try to manipulate the divine. So I think to them, that small object was very vital and effective.
So how do you then, how do you explain this sort of variation in the
With the rise of new imagery.
How does
so
that fit into this larger construct?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that in the Neo-Assyrian period, we do have texts that talk about the importance of making sure that things are in line with tradition, and whether it's rituals or imagery. So there's texts that talk about, this particular ritual, it's not real, so-and-so's father made it up. So even though people were clearly coming up with new iconographies and new ways of thinking, it always had to be couched in terms of this flow of tradition. And we see that with the sun god tablet, for example, where this priest essentially fabricates that he finds this authoritative image without which you can't make a new cult statue. And different art historians who have looked at this image, clearly it's not an old image, but it's archaizing. So there's always an effort, even with new developments, to make them appear as if they're ancient traditions.
But that only pertains to the images of the divine, right? It's not pertaining to Sennacherib's battles in the southeast or something like that. So,
well, I mean, it might if he's, we know that kings would often present their battles as cosmic, right? As replaying cosmic struggles from the Enuma Elish. So I think in that sense, they could kind of get around the newness by presenting it in a certain light, by framing it in a specific way.
good, thanks.
Are there any final questions? Yeah, David.
So thank you very much for the talk. I would like to know how you think this relationship between the divine and materiality that you've articulated for the first millennium is that kind of, does that configuration differ at all from older Mesopotamian ways of conceiving the divine? Does something change either in the way that artists are making the divine material in the first millennium, or is this a continuation of something that spans the whole Mesopotamian tradition?
I think it's a continuation. There's some specific changes that happened in the first millennium, like, the use of different materials for seals, for example, which kind of changed, or mutually the materials change conceptions, and conceptions require the use of new materials as ways of capturing these fragments of the divine. And the emphasis on light, the divine as light, is, I think, very specific to the first millennium. So I think, overall materiality of the divine is something that is very Mesopotamian from the beginning, but its particular articulation through different materials is what changes. In the back.
Hi, thank you for this talk. I have a question about, do you find evidence of the recycling of mines in the Mesopotamian cosmology? If there is is there a theory of metempsychosis? Is there a unifying principle that links, matter and with mind and body?
I didn't catch what you said. Recycling of what?
Of the mind. So when the body perishes, right?
Oh, okay.
Is there something of the mind that is preserved that has a longer lifespan? I guess the whole question is, how do they think of the relation, and is there something called a soul?
That's a great question. Yeah, so in the Mesopotamian view, the body was composed of a number of features. So bones, flesh, blood, as well as several entities that have been translated as spirits or ghosts. I'm not an Assyriologist, so I can't really, argue either way whether those are correct translations, but they seem to be very physical entities, these ghosts. So for example, one of these so-called ghosts is what resides in the netherworld after death, and this entity needs to be fed regularly and given water. It's not a kind of floating ghost, that doesn't require physical things. It does. And it's also physically connected to the bones of the person. So you can't really, a person is never fully dead unless you destroy their bones. So that's, I hope that answers your question.
It's just trying to, it's really wonderful. Thinking about the connections to other civilizations, and how they're thinking of the matter question.
Yeah.
And what allows matter to even form.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Actually, just picking up on that, in comparison to other civilizations, one of the things that I loved about your presentation of the rays of the sunlight and versus the sun god, starlight versus the deification of the constellation, it reminded me, of course, of Greek religion, but it strikes me as different. So thunder becomes Zeus's thunderbolt, the sun becomes Apollo's chariot. So it's not just that exactly this, at one level, exactly the same thing is happening. The animism of nature, where it gets personified to figurines of images of anthropomorphic gods,
Right.
plus their appurtenances, now, I wonder if that, because with the ancient world, one of the difficulties is that the textual material is scanty,
Right.
but there is some, always. And I wonder if you can draw some parallels of the degree of disanalogy, which I suspect is there, but I can't put my finger on it, with, say, Greek religion.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could, that would really be wonderful if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I haven't looked at the Greek sources very much, but I think that would be a great direction to go. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Very beautifully wrapped offices of life.